Hi, I'm Fed and I'm learning to make by watching tons and tons of videos and pouring them all through my eye holes and into my brain bucket. In today's video, I'll show you how I made a potted plant stand out of wood scraps.
Hi, I'm Fed. Ouch.
Woodworking is a great hobby. There's lots to learn, it's really satisfying, but you end up with a lot of scraps. After building 3 workbenches, a wood rack, and a boom arm, I have more scraps than I can shake a stick at, or a scrap at. You know what? I don't even know what that means. What does this do? I don't know. Who cares? I have a lot of scraps, is what I'm trying to say. So when my wife told me that she was going to buy a stand for the potted plant in our living room, I said, "This sounds like a project for me, Fed. I'm learning to make stuff." To which she said, "Okay, make your thing." First thing I did was measure the pot. Next, I asked my wife what kind of stand she liked, and she sent me to a webpage with this plant stand. Then I Da Vinci'd up some drawings in my trusty notebook. It was a simple design that even I can manage: 4 legs and 2 cross pieces. I looked through my wood scrap pile and selected cutoffs of 2x4s that were in decent condition and were long enough to be either a leg or a cross piece. Because I knew I'd be cutting and sanding the pieces, I made sure to reject any scraps that had nails in them. And I made myself a nice set of wooden cards by cutting off the ends of the 2x4s. Pick a slice, any slice. Using my new fancy schmancy table saw workbench, I cut the scrap 2x4 pieces in 2. I've gotten pretty good at cutting and trimming 2x4s and found that a feather board is really helpful. Then I trimmed the sides off of those pieces to a width of 1.5 inches. My goal was to end up with pieces that were 1.5 inches square, figuring that the 2x4s were already 1.5 inches thick. Later on, I discovered that wasn't quite the case, so the pieces weren't uniformly 1.5 inches on each side. By the way, look at this crazy knot. It really surprised me how much harder it made cutting through the 2x4. Now I had a bunch of roughly 1.5 inch square stock and could take my pick of the best pieces to use. There were 2 shorter pieces that were chewed up. I used them to make the cross pieces since they would be hidden by the pot. I measured and cut the first cross piece at 10 3/4 inches and used it as a guide to cut the second cross piece. This made sure both pieces were exactly the same length. Next, I cut the legs using the same technique I used for the cross pieces. I measured and cut 1 leg to 18 inches and used it as a guide to cut the other 3 legs. I prepared the cross pieces by sanding off glue and wood pieces from a previous project. This is a great little tool. It's a tiny square that also has pins so you can use it as a center finder. I decided which side of the cross piece would be facing up and marked them, but later changed my mind. The idea was to cut a notch to the middle line of each cross piece so that they would be locked together. Instead of measuring the cross pieces to find the notch lines, I centered one cross piece over the other and nudged it back and forth until it was exactly in the center. My newish bandsaw did a great job roughing out the notches. I finished them later with a chisel. My first idea for joining the cross pieces to the legs was to use wood screws. But using screws would be too easy, wouldn't look so nice, and I wanted to learn something new, so I decided to use dowels instead. After finding the center on the cross piece ends, I tried marking the center first with a drill bit and then with my trusty hole punch. Sometimes the mark moved off center, and I learned that's because when used on wood end grain, screws and drill bits follow the grain instead of going straight. Some of my holes ended up being slightly off center because of that. Before drilling dowel holes in the legs, I sanded them. I also picked and marked what sides of the legs should face in and what end would be the top. To increase the accuracy of my drill press, I attached a piece of plywood with clamps to make a fence. This was the first time I did this, and it made a huge difference. To keep the dowel hole depth consistent on the cross pieces, I attached a piece of tape to the drill bit. I used a hand drill for the crossbars and held them in a vise. Interesting fact about vices, they must be tightened to be effective. Crazy, right? I tried recentering the holes, but it didn't work. I figured out how long I needed the dowels to be by doubling the distance the dowel went in. When I test fit all the pieces together, I discovered that because the dowel holes in the cross pieces were off center and because my pieces weren't exactly 1.5 inches on each side, the cross pieces were no longer flush with the legs. I marked the sides that stuck out and also numbered each joint so I could put it back together correctly. I sanded the cross pieces until they were flush with the legs. Early on, I decided that the legs would look better with a curve on top, so I used a shop vac coupler to draw curves on the legs and sand them down. I know I've said this before, but sanding a curve down to a pencil line is one of the most satisfying things in all of makerdom. Next up, the glue up. You're so right, Huey Lewis. It's hip to be square. The pieces dried for a day and I did some hand sanding. I realized two things at this point. First, the cross braces did not have a tight fit. And second, I had made a mistake with the cross pieces. If the center pieces were flat, the legs wobbled and vice versa. You'll see in a bit how I fixed those issues. I applied a dark stain to the wood, let it dry, and then applied a coat of clear polyurethane. I'm not sure why I used a rag to apply the polyurethane instead of a brush like a normal person, but it worked. The final step was to connect the two sets of legs. At first I thought I wanted the legs to not wobble, but realized it would be better for the pot to have a flat area on which to rest. I could always adjust the legs later, which is what I ended up doing. To fix the poor fit on the cross pieces, I used a thin piece of wood as a shim. And that's the story of how I turned a few scrap pieces of wood into a beautiful and inspiring work of art, sure to be handed down from generation to generation. Okay, not really, but I really enjoyed making it. I got to use some scrap wood, and my wife really liked it, which is really the most important thing. So, bye! Interesting fact about vices. All the good ones are taken. There's lost to learn. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. Woodworking is as much fun as a barrel of monkeys. No. Who's putting monkeys in barrels? Like, that's just awful. It's not fun for the monkeys. Arrgh.